Hello everyone and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Thomas's dark relapse as hope mysteriously vanishes is not merely a plot point but a suffocating descent into psychological terror. A slow-burning implosion that transforms the narrative into a chilling meditation on loss, identity, and the fragile illusion of redemption. Because when hope disappears, it is not just a person who goes missing but the very concept that once tethered Thomas to the light. And from the first unsettling moments of the script we feel that something is profoundly wrong. That the air itself has thickened with dread as Thomas begins to sense an absence he cannot name, a hollow where warmth and purpose once lived, and this absence gnaws at him relentlessly, eroding the fragile progress he fought so hard to make, so that his relapse is not sudden but insidious, creeping into his thoughts through sleepless nights, fractured memories, and an ever-present feeling of being watched by his own past. Because hope's disappearance acts like a psychic wound ripped open, exposing the scars Thomas never truly healed. And as the script unfolds, we witness how darkness does not return as a dramatic explosion but as a quiet inevitability, a return to familiar patterns of self-destruction that feel perversely comforting to him, as if the shadows are the only place that never abandoned him. And this is what makes the mystery of hope's vanishing so terrifying. Because the script deliberately blurs the line between coincidence and something deeply sinister, forcing the audience to question whether hope was taken by an external force or whether her disappearance is intertwined with Thomas's own fractured psyche, perhaps even a manifestation of his fear that happiness is temporary and undeserved. And the more Thomas searches for answers, the more he spirals, because every clue feels like a taunt, every silence like an accusation, and the narrative traps us inside his unraveling mind, where guilt, paranoia, and rage collide, creating a portrait of a man who is both victim and potential monster. And the script's power lies in how it refuses to offer easy explanations, instead allowing Thomas's relapse to mirror the audience's growing unease, as we begin to suspect that hope's role in his life was never just supportive but stabilizing, almost symbolic. And without her presence, Thomas loses his moral compass, his emotional anchor, and even his sense of reality. So that darkness does not simply return but resurfaces like a long-buried entity that was waiting patiently for the moment it could reclaim him. And as Thomas unravels, we see how his behavior grows increasingly erratic, his thoughts more obsessive, his actions more reckless, suggesting that the darkness is not only external but internal, a part of him that he never truly conquered, only suppressed. And the script masterfully builds tension by juxtaposing moments of desperate hope, Thomas convincing himself that hope will walk back into his life, that this is all a misunderstanding, with crushing realizations that she may be gone forever, or worse, that her disappearance is connected to him in ways he cannot yet face. And this ambiguity fuels the chilling mystery at the heart of the story, because every step Thomas takes toward the truth seems to push him further from redemption. And as the darkness tightens its grip, we are forced to confront the possibility that hope's vanishing was the final test Thomas was never meant to pass, a cruel twist of fate or a deliberate act by some unseen force that understands exactly how to break him. And the script's language reinforces this sense of doom, repeatedly invoking imagery of shadows, echoes, and vanishing light, creating the impression that Thomas is walking through a world that is slowly erasing itself along with him. And what makes the relapse so shocking is not just that Thomas falls back into old habits but that he does so with a terrifying self-awareness, recognizing the signs and yet feeling powerless to stop them, as if hope's absence has stripped away his will to fight, leaving behind only resentment and a simmering fury directed at the universe, at himself, and at hope for leaving him behind, whether by choice or by force. And this emotional complexity elevates the narrative beyond a simple mystery into a tragic character study. Because Thomas is not a villain in the traditional sense but a man haunted by the belief that he is fundamentally broken, and hope's disappearance seems to confirm his worst fears, that anything good in his life is temporary and destined to be taken away. And as the story progresses, the question, "Where is hope?" becomes increasingly loaded, transforming from a literal search into a metaphysical one, as Thomas begins to question whether hope ever truly existed as a separate entity or whether she was always an embodiment of the part of himself that wanted to heal, to forgive, to move forward. And if that is the case, then her disappearance signifies not just loss but surrender, the moment when Thomas allows the darkness to define him once more. And this interpretation adds a deeply unsettling layer to the script, because it suggests that the most sinister force at work may not be an external antagonist but Thomas's own unresolved trauma. His inability to accept love without fearing its inevitable loss. And the narrative teases this possibility through subtle hints, fragmented flashbacks and unreliable perceptions that keep the audience constantly off balance, unsure of what is real and what is distorted by Thomas's deteriorating mental state. And yet the script never fully commits to a purely psychological explanation, maintaining the chilling possibility that something truly sinister is at play, that Hope's disappearance was orchestrated, that Thomas is being punished or tested by forces beyond his understanding. And this duality is what makes the story so compelling, because it mirrors the human tendency to search for meaning in tragedy, to oscillate between blaming ourselves and suspecting the world of cruelty. And Thomas embodies this struggle in its most extreme form, as his relapse accelerates and the darkness becomes more pronounced, manifesting in violent thoughts, self-sabotaging actions, and an emotional numbness that contrasts sharply with the raw desperation he felt at the beginning of his search, suggesting that the longer Hope remains missing the more Thomas adapts to a world without her, not by healing but by hardening. And this transformation is deeply disturbing because it feels irreversible, as if each choice Thomas makes in his downward spiral seals his fate. And by the time the script reaches its most terrifying moments, the audience is left questioning whether finding hope would even save him anymore, or whether the darkness has already consumed too much. And this uncertainty lingers long after the story ends, because the script does not offer closure so much as it offers a warning, a stark reminder of how fragile hope truly is and how easily it can vanish, leaving behind a void that darkness is all too eager to fill. And Thomas's shocking relapse becomes a chilling testament to the idea that recovery is not a straight line, that the past is never truly buried, and that when hope disappears the human mind can become its own worst enemy, turning inward, feeding on fear and regret until the line between coincidence and something sinister dissolves completely. And in this way the script achieves its ultimate effect, transforming a mystery about a missing person into a haunting exploration of what happens when a man loses the one thing that made him believe he could be more than his darkness, leaving us with the unsettling realization that sometimes the most terrifying turn is not the disappearance of hope itself but what we become in its absence. As the aftermath of Thomas's unraveling stretches forward, the continuation of the script deepens the suffocating atmosphere rather than releasing it. Because once the initial shock of Hope's disappearance settles into grim acceptance, the story shifts from frantic searching into a more insidious phase, endurance, where Thomas continues living despite the absence, and this proves far more devastating than panic ever was, since panic implies urgency and purpose, whereas endurance suggests stagnation, rot, and the slow normalization of despair. And in this phase the darkness no longer feels like an intruder but like a resident reclaiming its rightful home, as Thomas's days blur together into a monotonous cycle of obsession and self-loathing, his nights haunted by dreams in which Hope appears just long enough to accuse him with her silence before dissolving into shadow, reinforcing the idea that even his subconscious has turned against him. And the script emphasizes how this prolonged uncertainty becomes a form of psychological torture. Because without answers Thomas cannot grieve, cannot heal and cannot fully surrender, leaving him suspended between hope and hopelessness in a state that corrodes his sanity. And as the narrative presses onward we see how his relationships deteriorate further, as those around him either withdraw out of fear or frustration or become collateral damage to his volatility, highlighting how isolation compounds his relapse, feeding the darkness with justification. Because Thomas begins to interpret every abandoned conversation and every wary glance as proof that Hope was the only one who ever truly saw him as redeemable, and without her validation his self-image collapses entirely, reducing him to the sum of his worst memories and failures. And this is where the mystery grows colder and more terrifying, because the script begins to suggest that Hope's disappearance may have created a vacuum that actively attracts darkness, as if something ancient and malevolent thrives on the erosion of human connection, subtly influencing Thomas's thoughts and nudging him toward destructive decisions that feel like his own but carry an unsettling inevitability. And the more he resists these impulses the stronger they seem to become, reinforcing the sense that this relapse is not merely psychological but existential, a confrontation with forces that operate beyond reason. And yet the brilliance of the script lies in how it never confirms this outright, maintaining ambiguity so that every supernatural hint can also be interpreted as the projection of a broken mind, forcing the audience to wrestle with the same uncertainty that consumes Thomas. And as he revisits places tied to hope, empty rooms, forgotten messages, abandoned routines, the absence becomes almost tangible, transforming familiar spaces into hostile environments that echo with her loss. And these moments are among the most haunting in the continuation, because they show how the past can weaponize memory, turning love into a source of pain that reinforces relapse rather than preventing it. And Thomas begins to exhibit a disturbing pattern of behavior, oscillating between reckless self-destruction and obsessive attempts at control, suggesting that the darkness has fractured him into competing selves, one that wants to disappear entirely and another that desperately clings to the idea that if he can just solve the mystery, everything might still be salvageable. And this internal conflict drives the narrative forward with relentless tension, because every step toward clarity threatens to collapse him further. And the script uses this paradox to devastating effect, illustrating how trauma often traps people in cycles where the pursuit of healing becomes another form of harm. And as Thomas digs deeper, he uncovers fragments of information that feel deliberately incomplete, hints that Hope may have been involved in something she never shared with him, secrets that destabilize his idealized memory of her and introduce the horrifying possibility that he never truly knew her at all. And this revelation, even in its ambiguity, strikes at the core of his identity, because if Hope was not who he believed her to be, then the foundation of his recovery was built on illusion, and the darkness seizes on this doubt, reframing Hope's disappearance not as a tragedy but as a betrayal, twisting Thomas's grief into resentment that justifies his descent. And this emotional pivot is chilling because it demonstrates how easily love can be inverted into rage when filtered through unresolved pain. And the script does not shy away from portraying the ugliness of this transformation, allowing Thomas to think thoughts he once would have condemned, to entertain impulses that terrify him even as they empower him, suggesting that the darkness offers a perverse sense of clarity and strength in exchange for empathy and restraint. And this bargain becomes increasingly tempting as Hope remains absent, her silence interpreted as confirmation that the light she represented was never permanent. And as the continuation progresses, the mystery surrounding Hope's disappearance becomes more symbolic than procedural, shifting away from concrete clues and toward thematic resonance, as Thomas begins to question whether finding Hope would restore him or destroy him entirely, because by this point the darkness has reshaped him so profoundly that the idea of her return feels almost incompatible with who he has become. And this internal contradiction injects the story with tragic irony, because the thing he believes he wants most may be the very thing he can no longer accept. And this tension crescendos as Thomas experiences moments where he almost feels at peace within the darkness, moments of cold calm where the chaos inside him quiets, suggesting that relapse has given him a warped sense of stability. And these moments are perhaps the most unsettling of all, because they imply that darkness can be seductive not because it is powerful but because it is familiar. And the script underscores this by paralleling Thomas's current state with flashbacks to his lowest points before Hope entered his life, revealing how little has truly changed beneath the surface. And this cyclical structure reinforces the narrative's bleak assertion that healing without confronting root trauma is fragile at best. And as the story edges closer to its later stages, the question of whether Hope's disappearance was coincidence or something sinister becomes almost secondary to the more terrifying realization that her absence has exposed truths Thomas spent years avoiding. And the darkness capitalizes on this exposure, urging him to abandon the notion of redemption altogether, to embrace the idea that some people are meant to break rather than heal. And the continuation intensifies this psychological warfare by externalizing Thomas's inner voice through confrontations with others who reflect distorted versions of his fears and beliefs, characters who accuse him implicitly or explicitly of being responsible for Hope's fate, whether through negligence, dependency, or sheer inevitability. And these accusations, regardless of their truth, further destabilize him, because they resonate with the guilt he already carries. And guilt becomes the darkness's sharpest weapon, convincing Thomas that he deserves his suffering, that Hope's disappearance is punishment rather than tragedy. And this belief marks a critical turning point in his relapse, because once suffering is perceived as deserved, resistance becomes meaningless. And the script uses this moment to explore the terrifying ease with which self-blame can evolve into self-annihilation, both literal and metaphorical. And yet even in this bleak progression the story preserves a faint, almost cruel glimmer of ambiguity. Because just as Thomas seems ready to surrender entirely, there are fleeting moments where the memory of hope resists corruption, moments where her kindness and belief in him resurface not as accusations, but as questions, asking him whether the darkness he has embraced is truly all he is capable of being. And these moments are deeply painful rather than comforting, because they force Thomas to confront the possibility that he is choosing relapse rather than being dragged into it. And this choice, however compromised, reintroduces agency into a narrative that has increasingly felt predetermined, complicating the moral landscape of the story. And as the continuation nears its conclusion, the audience is left suspended in the same unresolved tension as Thomas, unsure whether the mystery of Hope's disappearance will ever be solved or whether its purpose was never to be solved at all, but rather to act as a catalyst that exposes the fault lines in Thomas's soul, and the darkness that has returned no longer feels like an external force but like an inheritance, something passed down through pain, memory and fear, something Thomas must either confront or become. And the continuation reinforces the script's central thesis with brutal clarity, that hope is not a permanent state but a fragile relationship that requires vulnerability, honesty and resilience, and when it vanishes, whether through loss, betrayal or mystery, the darkness that rushes in is not new but familiar, waiting patiently for the moment it is invited back. And Thomas's ongoing spiral becomes less about whether hope will be found and more about whether he can survive the truth her absence has revealed, leaving the story suspended in a haunting limbo where answers are scarce, redemption is uncertain, and the most chilling possibility remains that Hope's disappearance did not cause Thomas's relapse so much as reveal that the darkness never truly left, only waited for the light to go out again. The continuation presses forward into an even more oppressive psychological terrain, where Thomas's perception of time fractures completely, days stretching into endless gray corridors and moments collapsing into each other without warning. Because once the darkness has fully reasserted itself it no longer needs momentum, only persistence, and Thomas exists within it like a man treading water in an ocean that has no shore, aware that stopping means sinking yet increasingly unsure why he is still struggling at all. And the script lingers on this suspended state to emphasize how relapse is rarely dramatic at this stage but instead becomes routine, almost administrative, as Thomas manages his despair with the same numb efficiency he once applied to recovery, creating a grotesque mirror image of his former discipline. And this inversion is crucial because it reveals how the tools he learned to survive can be repurposed to endure suffering indefinitely, turning resilience into a trap rather than an escape. And as Hope's absence stretches from mystery into presumed permanence, Thomas's mind begins to reinterpret the past with ruthless revisionism, reframing moments of warmth as warning signs and acts of kindness as manipulations. Not because the evidence demands it but because the darkness requires a narrative that justifies its dominance. And the script captures this cognitive erosion with unsettling precision, showing how memory itself becomes unreliable, how even Thomas's happiest recollections now carry an undercurrent of dread, as if Hope's smile was always foreshadowing her disappearance. And this retroactive contamination of meaning is one of the most devastating consequences of her vanishing, because it robs Thomas not only of a future but of a past worth holding on to. And as his inner world collapses outward, the external mystery surrounding Hope begins to feel less like a puzzle to be solved and more like a verdict that has already been passed. And this shift subtly alters Thomas's behavior, making his search less urgent and more compulsive, driven not by belief in reunion but by an inability to stop, as if motion itself is the only thing keeping him from confronting the emptiness at the center of his life. And the script underscores this by depicting Thomas retracing the same paths, asking the same questions, revisiting the same locations with diminishing emotional response, suggesting that his quest has become ritualistic rather than hopeful. And this ritual quality introduces an almost mythic undertone to the narrative, where Thomas appears less like a man searching for someone and more like a penitent performing an endless atonement, condemned to wander through the aftermath of his own choices without ever reaching absolution. And this is where the story's ambiguity sharpens into something truly unsettling, because the audience is forced to question whether Hope's disappearance is still an open mystery or whether Thomas has subconsciously accepted an answer too terrible to articulate. And the script refuses to clarify this, allowing silence and omission to carry as much weight as dialogue, reinforcing the sense that the truth, whatever it is, may be unspeakable and, as Thomas's isolation deepens, the darkness begins to externalize itself in subtle but terrifying ways, through auditory hallucinations that echo Hope's voice not as comfort but as commentary, through shadows that seem to linger just long enough to suggest intention, through coincidences that cluster so tightly they feel orchestrated, and yet each of these manifestations remains just plausible enough to be dismissed as symptoms of stress and grief, maintaining the story's delicate balance between psychological realism and supernatural dread. And this balance is what makes Thomas's continued unraveling so harrowing, because there is no clear enemy to fight, no single revelation that could restore order, only a growing sense that the world itself has shifted into alignment against him, and this perceived hostility fuels a gradual but profound change in his moral framework. As Thomas begins to prioritize emotional survival over ethical consistency, making choices that once would have horrified him because they offer temporary relief from the relentless pressure of uncertainty. And the script treats these moments not as shocking twists but as quiet thresholds, emphasizing how easily lines can be crossed when pain becomes normalized. And this normalization is perhaps the darkest development of all, because it signals that the relapse has moved beyond crisis into identity, that Thomas is no longer someone who is struggling but someone who has adapted to darkness as a way of being. And as this identity solidifies, the memory of Hope becomes increasingly fragmented, reduced to symbols rather than specifics, an idea rather than a person, and this abstraction is deeply tragic, because it means that even if Hope were to return, Thomas might no longer recognize her as she truly is, having replaced her reality with a construct shaped by guilt, longing, and fear. And the script hints at this possibility with chilling subtlety, introducing moments where Thomas reacts with suspicion or hostility to reminders of Hope that do not align with his internal narrative, suggesting that the darkness now filters even the light he once trusted. And this distortion reaches a critical point when Thomas begins to question whether Hope's disappearance was ever meant to be resolved, entertaining the notion that some losses exist not to be explained but to be endured. And this fatalistic acceptance marks another turning point, because it strips the mystery of its motivating power and leaves Thomas face to face with himself without distraction or justification. And the script uses this confrontation to expose the raw core of his character, revealing the depth of his fear not of being alone but of being seen without the mediating presence of Hope, because she was not only his anchor but his witness, the one person whose belief allowed him to believe in his own capacity for change. And without her gaze Thomas feels unobserved, unaccountable, free in the most terrifying sense, and this freedom allows the darkness to expand unchecked, manifesting in increasingly self-destructive behavior that borders on nihilism, as Thomas begins to act as though consequences are irrelevant in a world that has already taken everything that mattered. And yet even here the script resists portraying him as irredeemable, instead emphasizing the profound sadness of a man who has mistaken numbness for peace. And this sadness permeates the latter part of the continuation, giving it a mournful tone that contrasts sharply with the earlier intensity.